Oh, your presenter slides are
okay. All right. What if we do that?
So you can change, Dawn. You can go to the bottom of your PowerPoint.
Yeah.
There.
There we go.
Okay. So it is 3:30 and I am Anna Allegretti, and it's my pleasure to be here today introducing Dawn Hameline and Jane Nutter. And they're gonna talk about a clinical introduction to R&D, the how and why behind the specs.
Oh, there we go. Hi. Oh my gosh. Thank you everyone for sticking out and wrapping up your day with us after 2 very full days of some amazing content and educational material. I feel like I've learned a ton. And so today, Jen and I wanted to talk to you guys about research and development and really what the clinical application of that is. So my name's Dawn Hameline. I am an OT and an ATP. I've worked in the hospital system and in seating and mobility for, oh my gosh, over 30 years. Over the last 4 years or so, I've started working from the manufacturer side. And so it's been really interesting for me to be able to kind of combine my knowledge as an OT and bring it to the marketing end. One of the things I realized is that there seemed to be a disconnect between what the engineers or manufacturers knew versus what I knew as a clinician. And I just felt like this was a great opportunity for us to kind of partner and share that kind of information. So I've got Jen Nutter here with me, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Jen Nutter, and I'm the product manager for Mobius Mobility. I actually have a degree in biomedical engineering, and my master's is in innovation and management. I'm actually very new to the industry, about 6 months into it. I've been working for Mobius here. So I can pretty much provide the perspective of what it's like to be on the engineering side of things. And it's been really great to collaborate with Dawn in this presentation and just collaborate across the business as well. So I'm really excited to be here, and I just want to thank everyone for coming.
So let's start out and just cover some of the basic learning objectives that we hope you'll take away. The first thing is we want you to understand and be able to identify some of the primary influences on product development. We want to talk briefly about the process and intent of standards testing. And we hope that you walk away understanding the use and as well as the limitations of some of the marketing materials. Let's see, it doesn't want to forward. All right. Oh, there we go. So a little force. So if anyone was able to attend the opening session yesterday, Barry Dean did a beautiful job of talking about examples of R&D and how sharing that information was able to move products forward. He talked about simple things like a drool cloth and how that evolved into something that was able to help multiple people, as well as the Lucy system. You know, so that is very much what we were kind of talking about here. So in this picture, I want you to see, this is Dr. George Klein, and he was one of the first people to really invent and take forward a power wheelchair. So in this picture, it shows him and a colleague in that early development back in the 1950s. The interesting part about this is that it was all based off of a need, which is how most research and development starts. Veterans were coming back from World War II disabled and unable to propel a manual wheelchair. So hence the need was identified, and this power wheelchair soon came to be. Eventually, this was sold off to E&J. I think it was like 1956, and they then marketed it as a power wheelchair. Another fun fact here, this was really the first documented event where it was a collaboration between clinicians and health professionals and engineers, as well as bringing in the user or the consumer themselves. So here is just a picture of a smattering of different wheelchairs. You know, they're all power wheelchairs, and they are all directly related to their design influencers. You know, they all look different, but yet they all are a means of mobility. In some cases, some are standards, some offer more of those off-road capabilities, some are mid-wheel, front wheel, rear wheel drive. But again, it all comes back to the fact that who influenced them and who identified what those needs were that developed the, you know, what they look like today. So a critical part of product design is hearing from all of the stakeholders. You know, those end users, those consumers are such a critical piece of this. Healthcare professionals, whether it be physicians or therapists, contribute recognizing where these other needs are if new users don't know what that might be. It's very much a team approach, and we work together as partners into developing these products. Once these influencers have given up these information, that we then need to share and convey that information to the engineers who we need to take this design to the next level.
Mm-hmm. So the engineers are definitely an important piece as design influence. So what, being an engineer myself, we often hear the needs that come from family and caregivers, as well as consumers or healthcare professionals. And it's our responsibility to translate that into what the product requirements are going to be. So that original need initiates what those requirements are, but then it's important to keep bringing in that feedback from consumers, family and caregivers, as well as healthcare professionals, to make sure that you're still designing at each stage for that need. I know that as an engineer, if you let us go with the beginning requirements, we're going to make something that's really cool and really incredible. But is it going to solve the need? Well, maybe not. And it could be way more complex than it needs to. So it's important just to have feedback at every stage as being an engineer, as that's what dictates if it's going to actually be useful for the person that's using it. Regulations and standards are also important in this process because devices that are going in the field have to pass a series of different tests to make sure that they're of the highest quality to be able to support consumers in the field. Typically, these standards are made for about a 5-year lifespan, and that's based on the CMS definition. They sort of work hand in hand. And so based on the CMS definition that a power wheelchair will last 5 years in the field, that's how some of these regulation and standards were built. So these also play an important role in dictating what some of the requirements have to be, because we have to make sure that the products we're building are actually going to last the entire lifespan that we expect them to have. One thing that can be difficult in this process is understanding that the daily use of one user is going to be quite different from the daily use of another. So that's something that's difficult to categorize in these regulations, but definitely something that manufacturers should consider. And another important influence is the FDA mod database. And while it might not seem obvious, this is a great post-market analysis tool for understanding how products are performing in the field. So manufacturers will report if there's device malfunctions, and they can also see over time how many of these malfunctions have occurred. And if it's a repeatable malfunction that can cause injury or death, it must be reported by the manufacturer. It is also encouraged for consumers and clinicians to report to the manufacturers if an event does happen, as this provides valuable feedback as to how the product can change and progress over time. Even for engineers, the FDA mod database before a product has launched can be quite important, because we can look to that database and see what components are failing in the field. So if we look up the whole database across a whole year, I can see how many armrest failures happened, or if it was footrests, and we can improve upon those products before we even begin a design cycle. So that's another really important design influence that can dictate the requirements of a new product.
You know, Jen mentioned the fact that, you know, the engineers get a hold of a thought and they can make something really big and grandiose, and often need to kind of step back and regroup and look at the impact of the funding sources that might come into play here. So an example of looking at this whole cycle of influences is the iBot. A lot of people know it came out many years ago. And at that time, J&J had taken that over to sell it. Well, what happened was the FDA classed it as a class 3 medical device. Well, when clinicians and even J&J looked at it, they recognized that it was not going to meet a whole lot of needs being as a class 3 medical device. It really needed to be changed down to a class 2. But the cost of cycling back and going back to the FDA to get a change in class for that was very cost prohibitive. And so it was at that point that really J&J decided that they couldn't do that anymore. And they then sold the rights back to the inventor as a way to say, yep, we believe in a product, but it's not something that they were able to financially support. So we have the consumers liked it, the engineers were able to do the work on it, the healthcare professionals wanted changes, we needed a rehab seating, and it kind of went through all that cycle of testing, and then really it hit a financial barrier. So again, lots of different influencers in an example like that. So change and innovation can only be initiated when you've got different feedback coming in from users and clinicians, or even the formal medical device reports. So things like understanding or hearing back about what unexpected side effects or adverse events might have taken place. This can be as simple as, abrasions to broken bones. And this is something that clinicians or users themselves or family members, anyone, is encouraged to contact the manufacturer to let them know this. There is a procedure in place where manufacturers kind of log all comments or complaints that come in. They look at things like product quality problems. Is it doing what it's supposed to be doing or what it says it will do? They look at kind of that quality management and how well it's working, or if there are any defects that need to be addressed. They also look at risk management. I think somebody gave an example the other day about how nowadays vehicles have backup cameras. Lots of them have backup cameras. Well, all of this came about because there were so many accidents from individuals going in reverse. And so that kind of information needs to be gathered to be able to trigger a change. And so information, manufacturers, we want information. We want people to call. We need to know what's happening out there to be able to gather that information and set priorities and make changes where they're needed. The other thing is design ideas. We're not all users, and it's those people who are in it every day who are able to make those suggestions and recognize where some of the needs are. So hopefully people will feel comfortable about reaching out to the manufacturer and just sharing that information. It is not a difficult process. It is a simple conversation.
So this is the R&D process in its most simplest form. It never quite actually looks like this, but it always starts with that need. So the need comes in, and that's what triggers the actual design and prototyping phase. And we want to make sure that that need is translated through every stage of this process to make sure that we're actually designing something that's going to be useful for solving that need. So it moves from initiating and identifying that need, then starting with the prototyping phase. Then we move into testing, and that involves both ISO standards or ANSI resident when it comes to powered wheelchairs. And those standardized tests are really important for assessing the quality and making sure that these devices are actually going to last in the field. And then you can launch to market. So while this looks like a very linear process, it actually involves a bunch of different cycles, and it requires going from one stage back to the previous stage, and it's never just straightforward. So as you can see, you often move back and forth between stages. It's very fluid. Sometimes you're stuck in the need prototyping cycle for a very long time before you even move towards the testing. And that's because testing is expensive. So you don't want to test a prototype if it's not ready. That would be a lot of money, but you want to make sure that what you're designing is going to solve that initial need. And when you feel ready, and that's going to be, you know, if you think it's going to withstand the test of time and it's going to pass through that testing, then you can move into the testing phase, and then you can move from the testing to the launch. So even after a product is launched, it's important to look at that post-market analysis data on how are people using the device on a daily basis. Is it solving the original need that you initially tried to solve? Are there other problems that are coming up because of this new device, or is there a new need that's been identified? So even from the launch phase, you have to reevaluate, are there other needs to be solved, or did we not quite solve it the first time? So the R&D process, again, is never quite linear. It goes from one stage back to the previous stage. Then once you hit the launch stage, you reevaluate and move to the next cycle. And this is essentially how devices in the medical field become more advanced. So it goes through this process multiple times, and that's how we've ended up where we are today, where of course our version of powered wheelchairs looks quite different from the first one that George Klein had. So these are the two main test standards that are recognized. There's ISO, International Organization for Standardization, and then there's ANSI-RESNA, which are the American National Standards for Wheelchairs. So you either need to test for one or the other for FDA approval, but a lot of companies will test to both, as they both are recognized for different things. So for the ISO International Standards, these are recognized globally. So if you're looking to if manufacturers are trying to get CE mark evaluated for their powered wheelchairs, then they would test for ISO standards. But then if you want to get CMS and insurance reimbursement, manufacturers would test ANSI-RESNA standards, as that's what's recognized for that process. So they each are very similar in the types of tests that are performed, but sometimes manufacturers will need to overlap them depending on who their target audience is. And in some cases too, if they're doing CMS reimbursement or if manufacturers are doing CE mark, they might need a combination of both. But they both do overlap in what they test, and that's to make sure that devices in the field are going to last that 5-year lifespan and make sure that they're up to the highest quality that a user is going to be putting it through every day. And that includes hitting potholes, going over curbs, they might be going up ramps, and we just want to make sure that these devices are of the highest quality for whoever's using it, because that's their main mode of mobility. So we want to make sure that their devices are withstanding the test of time. So again, you don't need both for FDA approval, but you need at least one set, and that is how devices will then launch to market. So this slide just demonstrates a handful of the tests that are performed, both on the ANSI-RESNA side or the ISO side. They do overlap quite a bit, and I won't go through every single test because that would take quite a bit of time, but I'll just highlight a few of them. So for these different test types, it can be done either internally by manufacturers or externally, and you can pay out to a third party to perform the tests. But what's really important is that you're simulating the environment properly to be able to perform these tests and make sure that they're simulating what real life conditions would look like. So in ISO standards or the ANSI-RESNA standards, they give qualifications as to what the test has to look like and what the test setup is. That way we're simulating those conditions to the best of our ability. That way we know when a device is in the field, it will actually withstand those forces. For example, climatic testing, we often use chambers, and you can simulate those hot and cold conditions. That way, if you have a consumer that's in Florida, you know that the device can handle hot weather, or if your consumer's in Northern Canada, that device can also withstand that type of temperature. We also have tests like determination of obstacle climbing. So manufacturers can test different obstacle levels to see at what height their device can perform at. For example, the iBot can climb a 5-inch curb, and that was determined based on these test standards. So typically manufacturers will test from a minimum up to a maximum at different increments, and whatever increment they start to fail at, then they move to the previous, and that's their passing specification. So a lot of these tests definitely dictate what the specifications for a power wheelchair will be, and it's important to understand how these specifications are relevant to the consumer who's going to be using that device on a daily basis. So for example, too, there's static impact and fatigue testing. So how long can this device last, and will it actually be able to be used for 5 years? But how do we simulate that condition in a timely manner? So for some of these tests, we do the 2 drum and drop. And just to give a quick explanation, the 2 drum is when the test setup is these 2 wheels that will spin, and the powered wheelchair is placed on top of it, and it's just run continuously just to test how long it takes for the device to get fatigued, how are the batteries lasting, are the motors overheating. And those are all important things to know because we want to make sure this device is going to last. But it can be difficult to do in a test simulation versus real life. And when it comes to testing ramps and different degrees, we want to make sure the device is stable and it won't fall over. So these standardized tests are very important for simulating these real life conditions, but they're of course not perfect because everyone's different. And you're going to have this device in the field falling off curves, and you're trying to prepare the device as best you can. And this is the best way of doing it. So this slide just gives a visual as to what some of these tests might look like. I had mentioned the climatic testing briefly, but this is an example of what the chamber actually looks like. And it can be set to different hot and cold conditions. So typically they'll do a cold test where the device is put under a cold temperature. And once it's put under these different temperatures, it has to pass a functional test to make sure that there's no electrical malfunctions or any functional difficulties. It can also test for condensation. So you want to make sure that if you're going from a hot and cold condition, that you're not going to have condensation in these electrical components, as that would be very bad functionally. And you wouldn't want someone to experience that in the field, as that's a very big safety hazard. Then the next 2 images towards the right show static stability testing. This is for the iBot specifically, but it shows that on a ramp in balance mode, the device is stable and it will stay upright. It's not going to fall over. And the same goes from when it's in a lateral position as well. So it's on this ramp, but it's still staying in place and it's very stable.
One of the reasons these images show the iBot, both of us do work for Mobius Mobility, is a lot of testing is proprietary. So it's not very available for people to see what the testing centers look like or how they're doing their different testing. They do know what the standards are, and their testing units are set up specifically to meet those test standards.
So this is just a video demonstrating water ingress testing. So as you can see, there's a hose spraying directly onto the batteries.
I mean, as a clinician, I didn't know how they tested it. You know, I thought it was kind of, this is one way that it's tested. Again, other manufacturers may test it differently. Mm-hmm. And then in this case, you know, he's got water spraying on a user controller and, you know, coming at it from all different directions. Jen, do you want to talk about IP ratings?
Sure. So there's a rating scale for water ingress testing, and they also have it for solids as well. And the scale basically tells you how much protection your device has. So on this IP rating scale, for the video you just saw, it was for water. So it would apply to the liquid scale. And as you can see, it goes up from 0 protection all the way to it can handle waves and tsunamis. But what typical power wheelchairs are at is a level 4, which is essentially it's protected from light rain, but anything heavier than that could cause some electrical issues or could cause some water ingress. But they're tested to a standard of 4. For the iBot specifically, our power base is a 5, and then our user controller is a 4. And when it comes to rating for both solids and liquids, the scale, you put them together. So the IP number, the first number relates to the solids, and then the second number is for water. And so for the water ingress testing, it's mainly just to show that the device can handle these different conditions. And when that translates to a real life the simulation translates to real life conditions is if somebody's going out in the rain, you want to make sure the device isn't going to shut down and leave them stranded. So that's why this is very important, as it does translate to a real life condition that someone's going to be in. And so we want to make sure that we're testing to those conditions just to make sure the device will handle it well and not leave someone out in the open. So this is just another video to show a different type of test. This is drop testing. So as you can see, it drops the device from a specific height, and it does this for 200,000 cycles. So 200,000 is the number to simulate a 5-year lifespan for a device. And manufacturers do have some choice in how much they test their devices. So while they have to meet that minimum 200,000 requirement, a lot of times manufacturers will test beyond that just to make sure their device is really of the highest quality. And just for those users that, you know, put their device to the test, we want to make sure that it's also going to perform for them as well. So I know for the iBot, for example, it's tested with a safety factor of 1.5. So when it comes to durability testing and drop testing, we will put it through 300,000 cycles. And that's to make sure that all the components can handle that drop and that the power base is solid. And we do this for every mode as well. So it doesn't just apply for standard mode. Since the iBot has 4-wheel and balance, we also make sure that we test it in those modes so that no matter what mode a user is actually in, we know that it can handle those types of forces.
I think it's important to have heard the fact that the testing is reflective of the CMS definition of use, which is really looking at a 5-year life cycle, a 5-year lifespan for the overall product. You know, and the reason I think it's important to look at these tests and understand them is that 5-year cycle. You have to think about your users, and not all users are going to fit in that box of, you know, that typical average user who is going to use it in light rain and, you know, only go so many miles and, you know, kind of meeting those 5-year expectations. So I think that by knowing what those are and understanding that and knowing when it might be time to look and think outside the box based on what your consumers are needing. If they're going to exceed that definition, you really need to think about contacting the manufacturer and maybe asking questions about some of these other testing that's being done. So these testing results determine product performance specifications, and they provide a baseline for us to be able to compare devices in a different category. So here I just have a couple of different spec sheets. Ultimately, you know, they all contribute information and the clinic into making that clinical decision-making process. So they provide information, but if you look at them, right, we're looking at a lot of measurements. What's the height? What's the length? What's the turning radius? Okay, those are a lot of measurements. Most of this stuff that you're seeing here is present and on a spec sheet because ISO has a disclosure form. There is certain bits of information from the testing that must be made available publicly. And so that's what a lot of these are here. I think that, you know, we've got those as a majority is what you're going to see. We did talk about that there are some cases, Jen mentioned, where a manufacturer might test beyond the basic limits. And the benefit of doing that is they're able to market differently. They can then start sharing about the fact that a particular piece of equipment may go above and beyond or offer a different level of a feature level that otherwise somebody else might not be able to claim. So this is, again, a couple more spec sheets. Clinicians and consumers, they really need to be able to interpret this data in a meaningful way to kind of contribute to that clinical decision-making process and ultimately informed purchasing. Some potentially meaningful information, though, may not be on here. You know, I think about that when Jen was mentioning the climate tests, right? I had never seen kind of how they look at some of the climate issues, thinking about cold storage or, you know, we're up here in New England where the temperatures have been, unfortunately, in the negative numbers. People need devices that they can get around town in without fear that the device is going to fail on them. Another one would be kind of corrosion. You know, somebody who's maybe who lives by the beach and there's a lot of salt water involvement in the air, or even here where we've got a lot of salt on the roads. It's really important that we maybe look at those corrosive tests to see what that impact might be. And this person might be outside that box of that 5-year CMS definition. And And so important to understand again, that manufacturer should be able to answer some of those questions for you if that information is not readily available. So I throw this on there because I think that, you know, we have all these standards that are published. We have these standards that maybe we don't know without seeking them out, you know, and then I think about the user. Where are they getting their information to be able to make an educated decision on the equipment that they buy? This equipment is not cheap. You know, and before I were to go buy a car, I'm going to go test drive a few cars. Before I even buy something off of Amazon, I'm going to read the reviews. I like to know what other people are saying about that. Unfortunately, I think that's probably where the majority of consumers are getting their information. They're coming in and they're telling us, oh, we saw this on Facebook, or, you know, my friend posted it on Instagram. You know, I think that's helpful and fine in introducing, you know, some equipment and technology that's out there. But there comes a time when you really need to back up and they need to understand some of the standards. They need to understand really what information is out there around a particular product to be able to guide and make that decision. So it's just a different way to kind of think about what's happening out there and the way that we're looking at mobility. So we're wrapping up quickly. We spoke fast. So a couple of things, you know, I want you to really think about the role in influencing, your role in influencing product design. I hope you know that you can contact manufacturers and give them input, give them feedback, let them know about experiences that maybe your user has had with the equipment, or the users can contact manufacturers themselves. There's also reporting systems where people can report information directly to the FDA. I think we need to be mindful of the testing standards and recognize that their job is to ensure that the equipment is safe and effective for use, but that the spec sheets don't often include all those test results that might contribute to that informed purchasing. I hope to encourage you to learn to ask questions beyond the material that's provided and know that there's more information out there. And hopefully that will guide you a little further in making your decisions. We found this cartoon that we thought was kind of funny, given the processes that we provided. So, you know, looking at what the customer really wants. If you look at that first one, how the customer explained it, right? How's that interpreted? How the business consultant described it, how the project leader understood it, how the analyst designed it, and then we have how the programmer wrote it. With the beta testers, what they received. We then have it performed under load, which didn't work well. How the project was documented, not well. How the customer was billed. It's like a roller coaster ride. Then it was delivered, and obviously we have the seasons passing, how it was supported, and then what the customer really wanted. So getting back to that end result. So we really see about all those influences, and through the process, things have to continuously be reevaluated and adjusted to make sure that we're really targeting what that end need is and meeting that goal. So we can certainly see if there's questions. I also have some other resources that we have available to share. Let's see. Oh my goodness.
Really, there are no questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to comment below anything, now's the perfect time. I'll take this time to actually ask one of my own questions. It was when you guys were going over the testing standards, I was just wondering, when you reach a testing standard, is it verified by someone from like ISO or any other testing organization, or does the company itself just determine, okay, it passed all the tests, like move on to the next step?
So typically it's written up in a report, and then that report will be submitted to the FDA for that device to actually get approved. The process does get verified often at the test lab. They do testing and verification just to make sure everything's in order and to make sure that you've actually tested to all the standards that you said you were going to. And there's specific forms that can get filled out as well. And then those will get submitted to the FDA for approval. And then if you're doing CMS and reimbursement, it will be submitted to PDAC to get assigned a code. And that way that product that you're making can actually have a code to it and then receive reimbursement.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Bin asking, what is the clinical educator's role, Dawn, in the product development process?
Oh, sorry. So, I think there's a combination of things here. I have been in OT for over 30 years. In terms of the product development process, I have the opportunity to see and work with a lot of people who use power mobility. And I'm kind of that first set of ears when people are sharing, oh, how come it doesn't do this? Or if it only had, or, could you do it in blue? We're the first line. And the nice part about the position that I'm in, I can take all that information and actually make sure it moves forward. I think about when I was working in the hospital, people would say that, but I don't think I realized the power that I held and the potential for making change. I think we all have that. And, if enough people say it really should come in blue, it's probably going to come in blue, and so I think that we have more power than we think. And I think that it's an opportunity, and I have a direct line. I realize it's like one extra step for somebody to make that phone call and to reach out. And I know time is so valuable every day, but it's one more possibility. And so that's kind of how I hope to do it. I also have the privilege of working with clinicians. And so, clinicians can be tough. They look at a piece of equipment very clinically. And, I think many people are familiar with or have used the clout. And so that clinical limitations of use document. And so what they'll do is they'll look at a product and they will look at the goods, but they'll also look at the bads. They'll look at those areas that might be more challenging and recognizing where sacrifices might be made. And so they've got tough questions. And with those tough questions come some great ideas that are able to bring forward. And I get that opportunity regularly when I'm able to teach and work with other clinicians.
Wonderful. And the next question is from Alex. She was wondering, how does a clinician work their way into a job like this? I have found as an OT ATP, there are not roles that we qualify for in this field being a non-engineer.
Oh, don't think that. Oh, goodness. I have to go back from my experience. I kind of came into this position because in our world, as this product was moving forward, it didn't have clinical involvement. And it got to the point where some of the staff members had attended a conference and they recognized what they didn't know. And that was the biggest thing. And when I first came, I don't think I realized what I might have to contribute. I was like, I can tell them everything I know in one day. And then what are they going to need from me? But it's really, again, about kind of appreciating the level of complexity to what we do and the understanding that we have in looking at the whole person and being just one part of a big team. And so you'll find that there are a lot of clinicians out there that are involved from the manufacturer side. And so I would encourage you to reach out and make sure, and ATPs are very valuable in assisting with that complex rehab technology assessment and providing that service there. Absolutely.
Great. And the next question is about the testing from Mark. Are the testing reports ever made public?
Yeah, so these ISO disclosure forms, companies are required to have them, and it's public information that anybody can ask about. So they might not necessarily advertise it on their website or put everything into their specification sheet, which is going into their marketing materials, but you absolutely can call a manufacturer and ask about these reports, and they will tell you what the results were. So they might not be obviously made to the public, but you can absolutely ask a manufacturer for that information.
Cool. And Kendra asked, the iBot has been comprehensively tested. It meets and exceeds many test requirements. However, it does not fit any specific code or wheelchair group. How does this impact funding and reimbursement? Are there solutions in the works?
Right, so the iBot is definitely very novel when it comes to the reimbursement process, which makes it difficult for navigating that. So it's tough to classify because the iBot does so many things. So one code doesn't really cover it all. But in moving forward, we've gone from a class 3 device down to a class 2. So we're slowly checking off the boxes to try to work our way into what might be the reimbursement process, but it is difficult being such an innovative and novel device. So it's not always easy to navigate that process.
Yeah, and I apologize, I'm not thinking of who was speaking, but I did listen to a lecture yesterday where they were talking about sometimes getting a new code doesn't necessarily mean it supports reimbursement either. So I think that the iBot is challenged by not necessarily having a code. That is something that we are certainly working on. There is not a time frame on that, but it's something that we're working on. And then understanding what the impact of that with reimbursement, I think, is still yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the last question is from Steve. It says, will there ever be mandatory crash testing or a tie-down securement policy for occupied transport in vehicles? Or will there ever be mandatory labeling stating yes, no, crash tested, or suitable for occupied transport?
Yes, so I know based on the ISO standards, there's ISO Part 19, which states for occupied transport in vehicles, and crash testing is a requirement for that. So for example, the iBot actually just got approved for occupied transport, and we went through extensive crash testing to make sure that the device was secure in the vehicle. So crash testing is part of determining if a device is suitable for occupied transport. And when it comes to labeling, there is labeling requirements that come along with that, both with what goes in the manual, what label gets placed onto the device. So we have the ISO Part 19 label that goes onto our device. We also evaluate the iBot on a case-by-case basis because the seating configurations are different each time. So it's important for manufacturers too, who are dealing with these very custom seating systems, that they also take that into account, because whatever you crash test, you have to translate into what's actually approved. So crash testing is definitely important for evaluating occupied transport in vehicles, and there are standards to support that.
Yeah, and I mean, we all know users have the choice to use what's provided them or not. So things like, a pelvic positioning belt or a headrest, if somebody takes a headrest off because they don't use it all the time, but then they're in vehicles, for it to really be considered approved for being in a vehicle, you're supposed to have a headrest on. Those kind of things we don't have control over, but those are the things that have to be in place for the device to leave the doors here with that, Part 19 sticker on it that says everything is in place, and this has been crash tested, so it is approved for that process.
Great. Thank you for answering all of those questions. Those are all of the ones that we have. If anybody has any other questions that they want to ask, type it in the chat when you can.
Yes, we also have comments. And so BMA said, thank you, Dawn and Jane, great presentation. Simple and clear for those who are not familiar with product development. Janice Bernstein said, it's so fun trying to merge PT/OT background with engineers. We always want something to do more in a smaller packet. Engineers love that.
I'd be curious if anybody out there feels like they've had influence on product design and if they have other recommendations beside what we've said.
So I don't know if it counts, but like when they were doing the mini Explorer Mini, there was a long process of sending surveys to clinicians that work in pediatrics. And so then they did the Delphi analysis, and I think Teresa Plummer either presented today or yesterday about it. So the whole process of sending clinicians, how do you think a manual, like a guideline should be implemented for those devices? So that was a little bit different than the iPod. And I don't know if the iPod will need that because it's not for pediatrics or safety concern, but that was a little bit different in the process.
We do use focus groups where we'll put out either design ideas to groups to kind of say, what do you think about this? How would this work for you? Do you see that there might be any anticipated challenges with a setup like this, to try to get some feedback? But certainly, I feel like a lot of times with those focus groups, it's coming from the mind of a designer or an engineer, and not necessarily from the users themselves. When they come through and present, a design option, they've already worked it through because it's something that they've been living, and it's been. We tend to have a lot more success at that level than when we try to bring something we've come up with out to a focus group.
More comments. Persistence is the key to keep asking until you find someone who will listen. Jennifer, also, even partner with a manufacturer in your clinic is a great way to get started. Because Kendra had commented before, agree with Don's answer. Strong, experienced clinicians are highly qualified to work on the manufacturer side of the industry. Amy Morgan said, keep sharing feedback with manufacturers. We love to hear about it. So,
yeah, you know what else? I think that having clinicians from the manufacturer side, I know when I was a clinician and working with them, we kind of spoke the same language. And, I liked that relationship, that peer relationship that we were able to have. And I'm really happy to say now that I'm on this side, I feel the same thing. If I go into a training and I have maybe a technician or another member of our team with us, Jen, for instance, even as the engineer, Jen comes and can, she can work magic with some people. And then other times, they like that therapist perspective who understands bodies and what some of the needs are that come up there. So we definitely all fit a role. But it is nice. I think people tend to be receptive to clinicians from the manufacturing side.
A comment from Jordi Peniagua, the PT, it works at the VA. After many years practicing in the private sector, I will say after shifting to the VA, because we are able to directly work with the manufacturer reps, we are able to be heard more loudly. We are able to be, with James, we feel might improve wheeled mobility in our sitting outcomes. And Mark said, I have given manufacturers lists when they come out with new equipment that will make the product more functional. Ask Amy Morgan, she knows.
Here's prize in the I'm reading with, yeah, I know. I used to work in the VA system, and then I shifted to the private sector. I miss the VA. I miss it. I miss it desperately because you have the freedom to do the work that needs to be done the way it needs to be done. And I'm afraid that in the private sector, there's a lot of constraints. And so it doesn't always feel that you're able to go and provide that extra piece that you want, whether it's limited by time or funding. There just seem to be a few more constraints. And so the VA does some pretty amazing work and really do a fabulous job taking care of their veterans.
And the last comment we have is Kendra. Official documentation reporting helps. If there is a problem with a device, letting the manufacturer know is one step. Another critical step when there are problems is to submit a MedWatch report with FDA. When there are repeat issues, it grabs attention of FDA and manufacturer is required to respond.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the MedWatch it's a way to go in and identify if there are problems, and all of those problems, you know, we also we want to know those too, right? So that we can kind of manage those. If it's a significant problem, that is something that we would be notified about. And so we certainly track those and try to look at corrective action for every one of them that come through, for sure. And Kendra, thank you for getting in the last word.
If nobody has any other questions or comments, I will read the code for this session. It is, and I will type in the text box. It is 5W9YL. We're gonna type here. 5W. This is the code for this session. Thank you, Jen and Dawn, for your very wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for joining us today.
Everybody says thank you, great job, thank you, thank you. Lots of compliments. That's great. That's how you want to end a presentation. Okay, I don't know. Is Linda stopped recording?